There we go. All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Williams. I am the producer for History Author Talks, and I am glad that you could all join us this evening. We have had a storm go through the East Coast, and I'm sure those of you who are on the East Coast are certainly aware of that. As a result, it looks like people may be joining as we are moving into the show. So you will hear these little dings. I am just letting people into the show as they are able to log on. So I wanted to thank you all for coming. And we also wanted to announce our partner in history this evening. Our partner in history this evening is the Massachusetts Historical Society. I have not seen Catherine Algor, who is the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, sign on. She may sign on a little later on. We can introduce her there, but I'm sure that both our guests, Nina and John, can tell you about all of the work that they've done at the Massachusetts Historical Society and how important it is. With that, I am going to introduce you to our guest host, who will be introducing our authors. And if you have questions during the talks, you can use the chat feature to send messages to me, and I will forward them on to our guest host. Our question and answer period will be at the end after both of the authors present their books. So with that, I am pleased to now introduce you to Paul Lockhart. Oh, and I should say Paul is the author of The Whites of Their Eyes. This is a wonderful book, and The Drill Master of Valley Forge. Sorry, my background is getting in the way there. So with that, I introduce you to Paul Lockhart.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to introduce these two outstanding books and their authors. Today we're going to be hearing from the authors of two books on the origins and early stages of the American Revolution in New England. They overlap in time and space, but they cover two very different topics, or rather look at the opening phases of the Revolution from two very different and little-known perspectives. First up is Nina Sankovich. Nina is the best-selling author of several works of nonfiction, including Tolstoy and the Purple Chair, My Year of Magical Reading, The Lowells of Massachusetts, An American Family, and most recently, the book she'll be talking about today, American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution. I'll let Nina tell you about her book, but I do want to add, Nina, that I just read it this weekend, and congratulations on a really compelling read. Nina?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Roger, for setting this evening up. I've been so looking forward to this. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here with John Bell and with Paul. I've read your books, both of you, and it's just, I really look forward to our discussion tonight. We did have a tornado come through where I live, but we managed to make the technology work, so hopefully it will continue to work for me, and I'll be able to share my slides while I'm talking. And I'm going to talk, about my new book, American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution. And I'm going to go to share screen now so I can share my slides. So let me get that going. And then I start the slideshow. Okay, so is that working? You all see?
Looks good.
Yeah, okay, great. So here we are. This is a sketch of Braintree in the North Parish Church. And my book begins in Braintree, in the North Parish Church, with a funeral. And Reverend John Hancock, the father of John with a big signature, has died, year 1744, and a large crowd has gathered to come to the parish church to celebrate their pastor, whom they just revered. And Reverend Ebenezer Gay has come from Hingham to deliver the sermon. So I read the sermon that he gave for Reverend Hancock, and I was really moved by how much he spoke about Reverend Hancock's personal connection to everyone in the village. He was someone who encouraged All of his community supported them. And I'll read actually a line from the sermon. How sweet to us hath been his conversation, how sound his advice, how kind his assistance, how tender his sympathy with us in our troubles. So I chose to begin my book with this scene, with this funeral, because a number of American rebels that I write about are present at the funeral. And I believe that both the church and the tight-knit community of Braintree really were fundamental to how these young people developed and how they became leaders in the fight for colonial rights. Now, of course, in 1744, no one could have predicted that the future leaders of the American fight for independence were in that congregation. They were still very young children. In fact, Abigail Smith Adams was there, but only in utero, because her mother was pregnant and at this funeral, but Abigail would be born in the fall. So there's no way, actually, of course, anyone could have anticipated that these young people would grow up. But in retrospect, I think we can look back at the village of Braintree, look back at people like Reverend Hancock who guided the village, and really see how that community and that church and that system of faith and interdependence and a sense of duty and responsibility really were part of what drove these young people to become the people they grew up to be, really, which were the leaders of the independence movement in Massachusetts. Now, I first discovered Reverend Hancock and his village and this progeny of rebels while searching for an answer to a question that has long fascinated me, which is how in heck did the American colonists have the courage to break with England, to fight against and fight for independence from a country that was known for its amazing military powers, its naval powers, its empire building and crushing abilities. So not only how did they have the guts to do it, but I also wondered how the choice to revolt cut across class lines. How did it cut across gender lines? And so I began looking for community that I could really focus on, in which men and women from different classes, different kind of backgrounds, all worked together towards independence, all made the choice to revolt. And through a twist of luck, I came upon a book written by a quirky minister / historian named Daniel Monroe Wilson. And I got a picture of him here. There he is. There's his book. There's the man. In that book, I found this paragraph, which I just loved. Okay. In the aspirations and heroisms of that little community of Braintree, independence began. Few towns can boast of history more brightly colored, not only with deeds of patriots, but with the surprises of romance. Not only with the sturdy enterprises of plain liberty-loving farmers, but with the debonair discourse of the colonial gentility. Well, there you have it. I had the farmers, I had the gentility, I had patriots, I had romance. I knew right away that I had found my village to study. And I settled into my research, much of it carried out at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where I was lucky enough to receive a Mark Friedlander Fellowship to support my research. And I quickly got to know quite well the men and women about whom Monroe were talking. Now, these men and women that he was talking about were none other than, and I have another picture here, John Hancock, Abigail Smith Adams, Josiah Quincy, John Adams, Dorothy Quincy Hancock, and a forgotten hero of the Revolution that I had never known about was Josiah Quincy Jr. And I'll have there he is in the corner. You can see he was slightly cross-eyed. So there's Josiah Quincy Jr. He was a fascinating figure. He lived only 31 years, but in those 31 years, he packed many lifetimes worth of advocacy, writing, orating, traveling, and everything he did was in service of the interests of his fellow colonists. protecting their rights, promoting their liberties. So in my book, American Rebels, I follow these young men and women of Braintree through their youth and into adulthood, presenting their stories as a way really to understand how the colonists as a whole had the courage to challenge England, and also to understand what were the obstacles they faced, both personally and within their communities, to make that final choice to revolt. And by focusing in on the particular circumstances of these early leaders, I think we can all gain a greater understanding of just how monumental a task it was to rebel, and how ordinary humans took on that monumental task and really became heroes, the heroes that we know today. We understand what drove them to question their loyalty to the king and country, and to define a new set of loyalties based on the interests of their own communities and the welfare of their fellow colonists. Now, when I wrote American Rebels, I could have, of course, had no idea of the pandemic that would ravage the world, nor of the massive protests our country has experienced following the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and in support of Black Lives Matter. But what has occurred to me again and again in the events of the past 5 months is that the times I write about in American Rebels in so many ways reflect the political, community, and social actions we are experiencing today. Got another slide for this. The actions undertaken by the American rebels to secure their freedoms were also massively progressive, bold, potentially dangerous, and came out of many of the same frustrations and anger, really, that are fueling today's protests. Consider, for example, the objections to interference with the justice system now and back in the times of the American rebels. To whom did the appointed judges of the colonial judicial system owe their loyalty? Well, in the 1760s, Parliament sought to secure the loyalty of the judges in many different ways, and this went into the 1770s. And one way they did this was by changing the way judges were paid. Instead of being paid by the colonial administration out of taxes gotten from the raised by the colonists, paid by the colonists, the salaries for the judges would now come directly from the crown. So this new system of being paid by the crown was egregious enough to cause a vote of impeachment to be brought against the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Court, Peter Oliver. The case for impeachment was brought by none other than John Adams, who secured the vote for impeachment in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, but then faced the brick wall of Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who refused to remove Oliver from office. So in addition to changing the way salaries were paid, Parliament also instituted juryless trials. They denied the rights then colonists to have a trial by their peers. They also removed British soldiers and officers from colonial court system, and they would only be tried in courts in Canada or back in England. So in other words, the King and Parliament were doing all that they could to undercut colonial faith in the justice system. Now, this is something that we are experiencing now. There are issues over judicial systems now. Or consider the death of Christopher Cider. Young boy was killed on the streets of Boston, February 22nd, 1770. Cider was shot by Ebenezer Richardson, a Boston loyalist. Richardson had come to the aid of a neighbor who was being harassed by a group of young boys for selling imported British goods. The boys chased Richardson, I've got a slide for this, chased Richardson back to his own house where he fled to his attic, and then from the attic window, and you can see the visual there, shot down into the crowd, killing Cider. Now, as John Adams later pointed out in a trial following a different sort of massacre, soldiers quartered in a populous town will always occasion two mobs when they prevent one. They are wretched conservators of the peace. Again, does this sound familiar? Does this remind anyone of events going on in Portland? There are just so many relevant factors to what happened then, what happened now. And it's interesting to see how these young people from the small village of Braintree took their duty as citizens of their community so seriously that they became leaders against people to whom they had been grown to be loyal. So how did that choice come about? I follow all the different events that drove the rebels to make that final revolt. Now, a huge funeral was held for Christopher Cider, largely planned by the Sons of Liberty. This happened in February. It was a day, typical Boston February day, snow, hail, thunder, lightning. But over 3,000 people turned out for the funeral, in part to lament the death of the child, but also to protest oppressive British policing. Now, this was not the first time the colonists would turn out in massive numbers to protest British policies, nor would it be the last. The infamous Boston Massacre also arose out of a confrontation between colonists and troops. British soldiers sought to defend themselves, and the outcome was the death of colonists. Now, already in 1768, Josiah Quincy Jr. was anticipating the frustrations and controversy and really the rising tensions between the colonists and the British administrators. And he wrote to a friend about his growing disillusionment with the British government and its policies in the colony. And I think the letter, again, it just resonates with how so many Americans feel today. Let's get a slide of Josiah up here. This is the letter. He writes, "To see the daily blunders which are committed and the deep tragedy which is now acting on the political theater, and not to be moved, is to be an unfeeling wretch indeed. If the contempt and indignation of every sensible and humane man in Christendom were sufficient to explode a political system, it would be done." And over the next 8 years, England continued to tighten its fists on the American colonies by subverting the courts, condemning free press, prohibiting peaceful meetings, flooding Boston with occupying troops, offering immunity from colonial justice to British soldiers and officers, attempting to enter and secure private properties, warrantless searches, on and on. And the flames of protest grew hotter, brighter, wider, until they burst into armed uprising and ultimately revolt. Now, each of the American rebels that I write about responded to these crises of their times in their own particular way and arrived at the choice of rebellion along their own singular path. Now, discovering these personal experiences, sort of their personal journey, what drove them to make the monumental choices they made, was really in so many ways the best part of my research. What I really enjoyed was getting down into their daily lives. It was important for me to understand the big events, of course, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, the Boston Port Act, Boston Massacre, Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Siege of Boston. But I also wanted to know the details of the Patriots' daily lives, how they coped at home, how they coped at work with the crises, what they felt, what they ate, what they saw, what they looked like, what they smelled like. All of these details helped me to understand their evolution, what they hoped for, what they lost, what they mourned, how they rejoiced, all of it. I was able to discover through my research, so much of it done at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I brought that to the book to try to really explain who these people were and how they became the heroes they became. You know, for example, reading the notes that both Josiah Quincy Jr. and John Adams took in preparing to defend the soldiers accused of murder following the Boston Massacre gave me really an intimate understanding of how they each felt differently about the actions of the soldiers they were representing, than how they similarly understood sort of the role of justice in general, and particular in their colony, and what each hoped to achieve by representing the men that most colonists viewed as villainous murderers, really. The irony of having Josiah's brother, Sam Quincy, who as prosecutor in the case, Sam was largely viewed as loyal to the king, only compounded the issues at stake in the Boston Massacre trial. And yes, I also read Sam Quincy's case notes to understand his point of view in the whole matter. It was not what you might have expected. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. You'll have to read my book to find out more, but it's pretty interesting. So how did Josiah Quincy and John Adams end up representing British soldiers on the charges of murder? Well, Captain Preston, who was the man in charge of the men who had fired during the massacre, expressly asked for Josiah Quincy because he was known as the best lawyer in Boston, and Preston wanted the best. Quincy then asked John Adams to assist him. So why did the two patriots agree to take on the case? Well, it was in order to prove to Parliament and the King and all Englishmen that the colonists of Massachusetts were law-abiding, that they respected rights to counsel and trial and representation as guaranteed under British law, and that they were deserving also of having their rights restored to them, again, under British law. Josiah and John Adams put their all into the defense. They reminded the jury again and again of their duty to be zealous inquirers after truth, willing to hear with impartiality, to examine and judge for yourselves the testimony. And in the end, Preston and 6 of his soldiers were found not guilty. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. But Josiah Quincy and John Adams had done their job. They had brought a good defense. On the eve of the Boston Tea Party, Quincy was the last man to speak at Old South Meeting House before the carefully planned initiative was carried out. He sent the Tea Party on their way with these words: I see the clouds which now rise thick and fast upon our horizon. The thunders roll and the lightnings play. To that God who rides on the whirlwind and directs the storm, I commit my country. A crowd of more than 2,000 men and women swarmed down to Boston Harbor following a legion of men dressed as Mohawks. Now, I just want to take a minute to explain the significance of this costuming as Mohawks. For the colonists, the symbolism of the Mohawks related to their reputation for being fierce warriors during the 7 Years' War. So to dress as a Mohawk was to demonstrate bravery, fearlessness, and ruthlessness. Now, all in all, it took 60 men, little more than 3 hours, let me get these numbers right, to destroy 342 chests, release 46 tons, 92,000 pounds of tea into the sea. It was a successful protest, but it would bring the wrath of Parliament down on the city of Boston, the passage of the Boston Port Act, slaying more and more steps, which ultimately led to the confrontation at Lexington and Concord and the start of the American Revolution. Now, in closing, I just want to say that the path to rebellion was fraught, twisted, and in so many ways a constantly uphill battle for every one of the American rebels that I looked at. And when they decided to join the revolt, they put everything on the line, their lives, their fortunes, their futures, all in the hopes of securing liberties and justice and guaranteed rights for their communities. The immensity of their sacrifices, the great losses they endured, only amplifies how much they valued doing what was right for the world in which they lived. I'm going to finish up with a quote from Josiah Quincy Jr., written to encourage his fellow patriots, and I'm sure we can all find some encouragement in these words. So, may you have, these are him writing to friends, may you have the fortitude to suffer, courage to encounter, and activity and perseverance to press forward. I wish for all of us fortitude, courage, activity, and perseverance. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Nina. We'll have a question and answer for both authors after we're done with both their talks, correct, Roger?
That's correct. People can use the chat feature to send questions to me, and I will forward them along to Paul. And I also just wanted to take this opportunity to let you know I just sent you Nina's website URL using the chat feature. And I'm also going to send you after John talks, the link to bookshop.org, which is where you can purchase the author's books along with some other interesting books that cover this topic. So I will send that before the end of the show here. So Paul, why don't you take it over and introduce us to John.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Next, I'd like to welcome J.L. Bell. I think it's impossible to do research in revolutionary New England without running into John Bell. He's both the proprietor of the Boston1775.net website and a valuable resource to anyone working in the period, and an associate editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, as well as a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, a member of the American Antiquarian Society, and a member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. Today, he's here to talk about his book, The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, heavily researched and engaging study of a largely unknown background to the events of the 19th of April, 1775, in Lexington and Concord. John?
Thank you, Paul. I am now opening my slides. There we are. Thank you to Paul and to Nina for being here, and to Roger especially for hosting us. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in. As Paul said, I write a lot about the American Revolution in New England. I post a new article every day on my website, and I've been doing that since 2006. So that's a lot of little stories. But the Road to Concord is a big story in which I argue about an overlooked factor in how the Revolutionary War started in April 1775. I think that some sort of armed conflict was bound to happen. There had already been shooting up in New Hampshire in December 1774, but the specific details of what happened on the road to Concord, of British troops marching up there, running into the Lexington Minutemen, and then hitting a much larger contingent of Middlesex County militia, they came about because the British commander had a particular goal in mind. And that story starts back on September 1st, 1774. Back then, General Thomas Gage, the first royal governor of Massachusetts, the last royal governor of Massachusetts, and the commander-in-chief of all the British soldiers in North America, wanted to keep military supplies away from the local troublemakers. And in particular, he wanted to preserve the militia gunpowder that was stored in this powder house on a hill in the western part of what was then Charlestown, Massachusetts. So early on the 1st of September, British soldiers emptied this storage house. General Gage also had his men take 2 small cannon away from neighboring Cambridge, where a militia company used them for training. And by that evening, there were rumors spreading west and south through Massachusetts of the British Army shooting at crowds at Cambridge, or the Royal Navy bombarding Boston. It was a total massacre. It was a second Boston massacre. And the next day, 4,000 armed men streamed into Cambridge, marching in their militia companies. This was an armed uprising to defend the province. This was how the militia system was supposed to work. And then they discovered that there hadn't actually been anybody killed, there hadn't been any bombardment. The confrontation ended without violence. But this event, which historians later called the powder alarm, was revolutionary. The crowds forced the lieutenant governor and every other royal appointee they found in Cambridge to sign resignations or apologies. And by the end of the day, there were 2 new realities clear to everyone in eastern Massachusetts and soon in the wider sphere. First, the conflict between the province of Massachusetts and the royal government in London was not going to be solved politically. It had become, at some level, a military conflict, and both sides started to build up their military resources. We can see that happening on the 2nd of September itself, even as the crowds remained in Cambridge. Across the Charles River, the town of Brookline held a meeting to discuss their militia supplies. The other reality involves control of Massachusetts. General Gage's authority now stopped at the gates of Boston. He had troops in Boston. He had troops on a fortified island in Boston Harbor. In those places, he could maintain authority. As of September 2nd, 1774, in the evening, the rest of Massachusetts was, for all intents and purposes, independent of the royal government. Gage now had to worry about defending the Boston Peninsula against attacks from the mainland, which was actually pretty easy because, as you see, it was a peninsula with this narrow strip of land attached to the rest of Massachusetts. So that was all they really had to defend by land. He ordered his artillery regiment to place cannon on that narrow neck of land, which meant he was pointing guns out at the very people he was supposed to govern. There were a lot of other cannon, not just the Royal Artillery's cannon around Boston, in shore batteries built to protect the harbor. So for instance, the Charlestown battery north of town contained 5 cannon, 18-pounders, meaning they could fire balls weighing 18 pounds. And in early September, the people of Charlestown hauled all those guns away. To the south was Dorchester, and on September 12th, the Great Gun at the mouth of the Neponset River disappeared. These were the people of those towns taking control of what they considered their own military assets for their own defense. There were other cannon inside Boston itself, not belonging to the British Army, but inside local fortifications or belonging to private citizens. And in particular, Boston had a militia artillery company that trained with small brass cannon, 4 cannon in all. And their company kept their weapons in 2 small gun houses or armories near the center of town. This is a builder's sketch of one of those armories built in the late 1760s. It was about the size, I think, of a 2-car garage. And here is where those armories were located, where the blue circles are. Now, there was a deep split in that militia company. The officer in command leaned towards the crown. He who had been born in England, he did not want to leave. The junior officers and most of the enlisted men were strong patriots. They felt that they were standing up for the rights and privileges of Massachusetts. On September 5th, 1774, the company was supposed to have a training day, but instead of drilling, it looks like they just argued with each other, and all the men quit and refused to serve under that commander. Well, General Gage didn't want to lose control of that company's 4 field pieces, brass cannon. They were useful in battle. So he, quote, ordered a double guard to the new and old gun houses. So now those places were under Redcoat control. On the night of Wednesday, September 14th, the Royal Navy moved to secure some cannon in batteries overlooking the harbor, here and here. Those batteries were threatening their ships, so the Royal Navy really didn't want to have cannon pointed out at the water. That worked. That operation made it more secure for the Royal Navy. But in the morning, General Gage discovered that sailors weren't the only people busy that night. There was an opening in the side of the militia-trained older gun house, and the 2 brass cannons stored inside were missing. Naturally, General Gage put an even stronger guard in front of the new gun house. That site already seemed quite secure. It was right beside Boston Common, and you can see that that was where the King's Own Regiment was camped. The gun house door was opened on the street facing that camp. It was guarded, it was locked. The militia commander had the only key. Now, there was another wider door around on the right side here, but it was barred on the inside. And even to get to that side door, that meant you had to go through a gate in full view of the Army camp, or over a high fence around the yard, or possibly through the South Riding School next door. And that school was in session nearly the whole day with about 200 boys in it. So there seemed to be no way to get to those brass cannon inside. But even that situation didn't seem secure enough to General Gage. So on Friday, September 16th, artillery officers got the key to the gun house from the company commander and went there to remove those cannon into the British Army camp where they would be completely secure. But when the squad opened the gun house, the guns were gone. All 4 of Boston's brass cannon had vanished within 3 days from buildings under Redcoat Guard. So that's one of the mysteries I investigated in The Road to Concord. How did the Patriots steal those weapons? How did they smuggle them out of a town full of thousands of Royal soldiers with only one small road to going out that was already fortified? But this is more than the story of that one event, because there were still more cannon in Boston in September 1774, and there was a competition to grab those, and that became what I call an arms race. This calendar of September 1774 lists all the major military developments in and around Boston, starting with the British troops taking the gunpowder from Charlestown on the 1st, and the next day's powder alarm. And the blue stars indicate when the provincial resistance gained control of cannon, and the red stars indicate when the Royal Military did. And when we line up all those little events, we can see the conflict in Boston, in Massachusetts generally, moving towards war. Now, to his credit, General Thomas Gage didn't give up. And that is the second half of The Road to Concord. he started an effort to infiltrate the Patriot movement in Massachusetts and to ferret out where those rebels were hiding their cannon so he could try to get them back. On February 21st, 1775, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety and Supplies met in Charlestown, and John Hancock was the man in charge. That committee decided they had a control of enough cannon to start organizing artillery companies out in the countryside. So they were forming an army for war. On that same February 21st, according to documents in his files, General Thomas Gage suddenly had a lot more intelligence about the Patriots' weaponry. He knew that the committee had 38 guns. He knew in what towns those guns were being stored in. He knew which blacksmiths were making carriages for those guns. General Gage had a spy on the Committee of Safety. And here is a bit of a ciphered letter that spy wrote later in 1775. On February 22nd, the day after receiving that intelligence, Gage wrote out instructions for 2 Army officers to hike out into the Massachusetts countryside in civilian clothing. Those men were to look for weapons and to take notes on roads and towns and fords and other geographic features, because Gage expected to have occasion to march troops through the country the ensuing spring. So Gage was also moving towards a military solution. Even as those men were out on their mission, Gage got more intelligence, and he set hundreds of troops to search for cannon in Salem. Their ship docked in Marblehead on the morning of Sunday, February 26th. The soldiers reportedly stayed below decks until most of the townspeople had gone into their meeting houses and churches, and then they started to march towards Salem. And in fact, in Salem, this man, a painter named David Mason, was working for the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. He had collected about 12.5 cannon from local Patriot sea captains and shore batteries, and he had a blacksmith mounting them on carriages at a shop in the north of town. But Mason heard about the approaching troops in time to pull up a drawbridge and block them from getting to that blacksmith shop until he had hauled the weapons away. For a while that Sunday afternoon, the British troops and the locals were facing off against each other, with armed militia companies watching from a distance. Again, the events were moving closer and closer to war, but still nobody had been shot yet, nobody had been killed. Around the beginning of March 1775, General Gage developed another intelligence source out in the Massachusetts countryside, probably in Concord. On March 8th, that spy sent a message to General Gage telling me exactly where the 4 brass cannon from Boston had ended up. They were hidden in a cellar on a farm in the western part of Concord, the home of James Barrett, a 65-year-old farmer and colonel of the Middlesex County Militia. On April 14th, General Gage received new orders from his boss in London. Lord Dartmouth told him he did not merely authorize Gage to take military action, he told the general that he had to act. The ministry specified that the first and essential step would be to arrest the principal actors and abettors in the rebel government. But Gage didn't move to arrest anyone. He wasn't tracking John Hancock or Samuel Adams or any of the other politicians. He was tracking the cannon. And specifically, he was asking about the 4 brass cannon from Boston. Seizing those guns at Barrett's farm would require a march deep into hostile territory. 17 miles to Concord, another 2 from the center of town across the North Bridge to the farm. And each of those miles meant the troops would be more tired. Every quarter hour the men spent searching would leave them more exposed to a militia response. But if the mission succeeded, it would erase the embarrassment of having let those guns get away from Boston in the first place. And the ministers in London were telling Gage it was time to act. So he wrote out his first draft of orders. And the top item he wanted the soldiers to look for was 4 brass cannon and 2 coal mortars in the cellar or outhouses of Mr. Barrett. Already, however, the Barrett family had started moving the most important military supplies to other towns. The Barretts were continuing to work at that, hiding weapons close to the farm and even in their attic as the Redcoats began to march out of Boston on the 18th of April. And along the road to Concord, those British soldiers came across the Lexington Militia Company lined up on their common, and they were shooting, and this time men died. And that was when the war began. For the Massachusetts Patriots, that skirmish meant that they could portray the start of the war as the result of aggression by the Royal Army. They had no reason to tell the world that they were actually collecting and hiding cannon in the countryside. And as for General Gage, declaring that he knew the Massachusetts rebels had cannon, including some taken from under his nose in Boston, well, that would have raised a lot of questions in London. So both sides kept secret what they knew about Concord, and that those cannon did not become part of the standard story of what happened on the road to Concord. That is the story I want to tell in this book, along with a lot of other ancillary stories that tie in. And I'm looking forward to talking about how that fits in with the overall story of Massachusetts revolting with Nina and Paul.
Great.
Well, thank you, John. Thanks to both of you. I've got a couple of questions for both of you. First, and while we're waiting to see if anybody in the audience has questions for you. First for Nina. The American Rebels, you make a point of exploring the road to independence, as you pointed out, from perspectives of both men and women. Specifically relating to women, how did the personal experiences of women color their perspectives of the movement for independence, and what interest did they have in the revolution, and what did they possibly gain or lose?
Yeah, well, the women that I looked at, they really experienced sort of the real nitty-gritty impacts of first having tensions with the British, and then the boycotts that were instituted and the actions that the British took in response to the boycotts and to other actions that the Patriots had undertaken. The women were sort of the ones who really, they were the ones keeping the farms running, the homes going, and they had to do that under these really onerous burdens in terms of getting supplies for their family, in terms of keeping the farms running, in terms of managing household economies and incomes. Most people had a little something going on the side, some kind of home store or other business that helped them. For example, Abigail Adams was largely, in the years leading up to the revolution, left at home. John was either in Boston or when the Continental Congress began meeting in Philadelphia, and she was the one trying to keep the farm running, trying to keep the fields being taken care of and crops being brought in. And she had really practical considerations about what was happening in her community. And these made her, I think, have a more, in some ways, the women that I studied were almost more ready for action to be taken than the men, because they were experiencing what it was to live in a community that was uncertain about its future, uncertain about when supplies would be available, uncertain about planning for their children's future, uncertain about community safety, sort of these practical issues, and they wanted to have resolution. And they played many roles in addition, in terms of, they kept their eyes out for who are the British officers coming through our village now? Who are the deserters? What's going on over there in Boston? What's going on in our towns? So they were very practically involved. And in terms of what did they have to lose in a revolt, it was the family security. It was the security for their children, the security of the farms. But they sort of understood early on what the uncertainty of British administration was doing to their futures, to their stability of their community. So they were willing to take these pretty bold stances. And of course, in terms of seeing the revolution as an opportunity for themselves to perhaps have more voice in their communities. I mean, they were given these new responsibilities because everybody had new responsibilities as the world was turned upside down. And they thought, well, maybe we can actually have more of a prominent role in our communities for good. And of course, we all know about Abigail's famous letter to John, remember the ladies, think about us when you're thinking about a new government in a new country. And Abigail also wanted him to think about the Blacks in Massachusetts and in all the colonies and think about their role in the new country. So the women had a really important and varied and practical role in bringing sort of their communities towards accepting and even pushing for big change and for revolt.
Thank you, Nina. Oh, Roger, before we go on, you'd wanted to say something before the Q&A, and I didn't let you have the opportunity.
Thanks. No, I wanted to mention that I did get a chance to mention it earlier. The author's books are available at bookshop.org. I sent the link to everybody using the chat feature. So if you want to order the author's books, there's also some other books that I've thrown in there, including Paul's books as well. So you should visit bookshop.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. John, I have a question for you from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, you focus on particular individuals, Gage, I suppose, but others too?
Yes. Gage is the primary protagonist from the British point of view, of course. From the provincial point of view, it's a tag team where the actual physical custody of some of the guns moves along from one person to another. One of the most important figures sort of tying a group together is Dr. Joseph Warren, who was basically, once the real conflict started, he was quickly vaulted from being a second-tier leader at the beginning in the summer of 1774 to being the top guy in the Massachusetts resistance by the end of that year. Other senior people were absent, busy in Philadelphia, sick. Josiah Quincy went off to England on a diplomatic mission. William Molyneux died, and so on. So it was all came down to Dr. Joseph Warren, and he was on the Committee of Safety and Supplies, and they asked him to go into Boston and find out who had those guns. One of the people he was asking was William Dawes, another figure that a lot of people, a name that will be familiar to people who know about the story of the April 19th, 1775, because he was the second rider with Paul Revere. Well, he was also the adjutant of the Boston Militia Company, which meant he was the man who kept track of who all the people were, kept track of when the drills were, where the supplies were. So if you wanted to know where those cannon had disappeared, he might not have known it, but he certainly knew who would know it. And he was the one who went in. But also I have a whole chapter in the middle of the book about a family named Gore. And in particular, a young man named Samuel Gore. His first prominent moment in the pre-revolutionary Boston is at a moment that Nina talked about, when that customs man shot out from his upper window at a crowd of boys that had been protesting in his neighborhood. Well, that man killed a little boy named Christopher Cider, but he also wounded a 19-year-old named Samuel Gore. Samuel Gore then later went on to participate in the Tea Party, another event Nina talked about. And then in September 1774, he was a member of the Boston militia train, and he was the one who survived long enough that it was safe to explain how they got the guns out of one of those gun houses. And in order to assess his story, I went and looked at his family's history in much the same way that Nina looked at the histories of those families from Braintree to see how they became revolutionary, what pushed them to make that political choice. And in the Gore's family case, it's very interesting because although Samuel and his brother-in-law Thomas Crafts were very strong patriot activists, Samuel's father, John Gore, became a loyalist and went to London and lived there for the length of the war before coming back in the 1780s. So it was a split family with a lot of secrets, not only secrets from the royal authorities, but secrets they were having to keep within themselves. And that is the sort of individual story I love to investigate.
Thank you, John. Nina, I have a question for you from the audience. What percentage of Braintree would you classify as being loyalist in 1775?
I would say that in 1775, based on the research that I did, there were some definitely dyed-in-wool loyalists. Were not going to change. But less than half of the population. What you definitely had, and you see this in most of the villages, and you see it in Boston, were the people who were not going to commit either way. They just wanted to get on with their lives, and they did not call themselves rebels. They did not necessarily call themselves loyalists. Now, what you did have was a significant number of people in Braintree who did join the militia, who did engage in securing powder, John, securing powder, stealing powder, hiding powder. So I would, in terms of how it was described in the years after, it was described as a village that joined the rebellion. But there were people, men and women, who did not alter their sort of loyalty to the crown, and wore, and there were some who wore black on the days of celebrating independence. So you had that split. But of course, the ones that I looked at were the ones who chose to revolt.
Nina talked about this moment in September 1774 when some of the more radical people of Braintree went to the powder house in the north of town and took away the powder. And as Abigail Adams was, we know about this from her account, she was looking out the window and saw this happening. And they passed by, and they knew who she was. They knew that her husband was away at the Continental Congress. They trusted her, so they told her, "We think there are too many Tories in this part of town. We're taking the powder away. Do you want any?" And she said, no, it's in good hands, thank you. But that is the sort of intimate moment that shows the intersection of these stories.
John, I have two questions I'm going to conflate for you. They're both closely related. First of all, what was left of Bartlett's farm when the British arrived at Concord? And second, what happened to those 4 cannon?
Okay. Well, Barrett's farm, when the British arrived, and we all know about the North Bridge, but getting to the North Bridge was sort of like getting in orbit around the moon. Getting to Barrett's farm was getting to the surface of the moon. That was the real aim of the mission. When they got out there, they found the British soldiers who were there, 3 or 4 companies, they found a very little. Supposedly, the Barretts had not only moved a great many of the big heavy weapons to other towns, but they were burying some in their fields and plowing over those weapons with dirt. Reportedly, they had a barrel of musket balls up in the attic, and they threw feathers on top of the musket balls, so it looked like a barrel just of feathers. The British, nevertheless, the soldiers found some wheels, which they recognized as likely wheels for the carriages for cannon. And they set out to destroy those wheels, and they were in the middle of that when they heard the firing of guns at the North Bridge, and they left. Colonel James Barrett, the farmer in charge, he spent most of that midday on horseback, riding back and forth between all his militiamen at the bridge, worrying about them, then riding back within probably eyesight of his farm, worrying about his family, then riding back. And so we really don't know where he was. He gave a sort of general deposition. But so the person who was really in charge there at the farm was his wife, who, when the British officers came in, offered them some food and then said, "The Lord commands us to feed our enemies." As for the 4 cannon, they have an interesting story, but it's not told. I can trace them up through about the middle of the spring of 1775. Now, as cannons go, they're pretty small. They can fire 3 or 2 pound balls. And for a big siege, like trying to get into Boston, you needed a cannon that could fire 18 pound balls, 24 pound balls. So suddenly these cannon, which had seemed so important to both sides before April 19th, on April 20th, they look kind of dinky and not very useful. And so nobody seems to be paying much attention to them. During the war, again, the Continental Army's paperwork does not survive in very good shape, so we don't know. But come the 1780s, Governor John Hancock wrote to Secretary of War Henry Knox after the fighting was over and asked, could we have those 4 cannon back? Because they are still the property of Massachusetts. And Secretary Knox wrote back and said, well, 2 had been captured during the war, but he sent back the other 2, and he had them engraved with the names Hancock and Adams in honor of John Hancock and Samuel Adams, and he had them engraved with a story about how these 2 cannon comprised half of all the artillery that the provincials had at the beginning of the war. Well, we know that in fact the provincials had dozens of artillery pieces at the beginning of the war, but again, it served their purpose to tell the story that they were underdogs, that they had only 4 small cannon, and these were 2 that had survived. And so once those cannon were carved with their story, it became impossible to mistake them for any other cannon. And so we still today know where they are. One is now at the Northbridge Visitor Center at Concord in Minuteman National Historical Park, and one is in the museum at the base of the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston National Historical Park.
Oh, thank you, John. I've got a question for both of you. How often did it happen that families were split between Loyalists and Rebels?
I'll just speak briefly. I saw it all the time. It happened all the time. It happened in the Quincy family with Josiah Quincy, and his brother Sam. You see it happen all the time. You see it between husbands and wives, fathers and their children. So you saw it happen. What was interesting to me is to see that it didn't necessarily mean a rift of all relations, that actually they were able to disagree on this incredibly important political decision and yet remain, relatively close as family, with exceptions.
Yeah, yes, I think there are a surprising number, I would agree. And the dividing line between Loyalist and Patriot had a lot of factors going into it: religion, business ties, and then in some cases like Captain John Gore and Samuel Quincy, they felt loyalty because they had been given honors or jobs within the British government and felt that they owed a loyalty to the government, while other people in the family felt they owed a loyalty to, I guess they would say, their society. It is crucial that the words patriot and loyalist are synonyms. They're both talking about loyalty. It was different ways of defining that virtue for these different people.
Yeah, and although my book is titled American Rebels, at the time, they each side considered the other side to be rebels against what were really British values of, constitutional rights under British law and British ideas of duty and responsibility. And so it's interesting to see that too, how it is that perception of who is in the right would obviously would drive you to decide to become a patriot or to stay a loyalist. So it's not always clear cut, which is why the question is so fascinating of how they made that choice.
So with that, thank you, Nina and John and Paul. I want to thank you all. I guess what John and Nina have explained is that the politics that was going on in 1774 and 1775 is no less confusing than what's going on today. But I am thrilled with the presentations that were given today, and I want to thank you both sincerely for spending an hour telling us about your books. And Paul, I want to thank you for managing the process. I was trying to get the camera right there, so I missed it a few times. But this is terrific, and I really love doing these every week. I have a lot of fun, and I hope that everyone who signed on learned something. And I urge you to go read these books. They're wonderful, terrific books. Sign up for John and Nina's newsletters, and also go to Paul Lockhart's website as well. So I want to thank all three of you. I want to thank the Massachusetts Historical Society for being our partner in history tonight. And I urge you all to go take a look at historyauthortalks.com to see who we have coming up next week. I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember right off the top of my head. Let's just, if you give me 2 seconds here. Oh, yes. Next week, it's by George, Father of Our Country's Politics, where I have Mark Edward Lender, author of Cabal and The Plot Against General Washington, paired with David Head, author of A Crisis of Peace, the George Washington and the Newburgh Conspiracy and the Fate of the American Revolution. And our guest host next week is best-selling author David O. Stewart, who is coming out with a book called George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. So we've got a great show on next week as well. So with that, I want to thank you all, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Roger.
You bet. This was great.
This was great. Thanks.